Hello, BookTube. It's the final weekend of October, and that means the end of OcTolkien, the big event that I've been doing with Justin at Ghost Reader and James Chatham, where we read the signature works of the master, where we read our way through some of the big works of J.R.R. Tolkien and talk about them on camera. And to me fell the Silmarillion, the strange legendarium of Tolkien, the big legendary backstory behind The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. These are the ages of Middle Earth before the story that everyone's familiar with. We started with Eru Iluvatar and the Valar, his gods, and their creation of the world and all the races in it. And then we move, in the main part of this book called the Quenta Silmarillion, we move through the story of the vying of the Valar and the great elves, the Eldar and the Noldor, with Morgoth, who is himself a Valar, one of the gods of Tolkien's story, but evil. And there are great passages all throughout. There are great moments of loss and heroism. And then finally, at the end of the Quenta Silmarillion, Morgoth is defeated and banished out of the world, out of time itself, into an abyss, never to return. So he's not part of Middle-earth anymore. And likewise, the Silmarils, these three beautiful semi-sentient gems that have been the source of the compulsion of so much trouble in the course of the Quenta Silmarillion, are likewise out of Middle-earth. They each have all three of them have their separate fates, but by the end of that main chunk of this story, they're all gone. And that stops, the Quenta Silmarillion stops there, but it stops with a somber warning, as you remember from last time, where although Morgoth is gone from the world, his will still works in Middle-earth, tempting people to avarice, tempting them to dark thoughts, tempting them to doubt each other, tempting them to insurrection, and also moving votaries of that will to outright evil in imitation of Melkor. And one of the primary votaries of that ill will is one of Melkor's lieutenants, Sauron, who comes to prominence. He is still in Middle-earth. He is brought before the Valar because he is repenting. And we're told a very neat moment. We're told that some people say that he actually meant it, that he actually did repent, but that his own nature overcame him. One way or another, once he's back in Middle-earth and free, once it seems like the Valar are no longer paying attention to the events of Middle-earth, then he sets to work corrupting men, especially the kingdom of Numenor, a vast and mighty kingdom of godlike men, who, although they're tall and strong and valiant and far-seeing, are still more susceptible to Sauron's temptation than the elves are. The great races of the elves, the Noldor and the Eldar, are better able to see through the pretty disguises that Sauron can still at this point put on. He appears before men as an Arion, giver of gifts, a comely and attractive counselor. And he, slowly but surely, counsels the kingdom of Numenor to rebel against the Valar. And they are caught in a cataclysm when the gods react. And at first, Sauron thinks the cataclysm is funny. He laughs, we're told. And then it overtakes him. He is not invulnerable to it. We get a wonderful scene here where he comes as close as he can come to dying. For Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenóreans and the defeat of their proud king. But Sauron, let's see here. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Al-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm. And a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would now do in the world, being rid of the Edain forever, he was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the depths and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure. And that is the main, that story, the attempting to rebellion and the crushing of that rebellion and the flight of Sauron to Middle-earth, sort of to hug himself close to his one ring, is the main gist of the first part of what we're reading today, to finish out my part of OcTolkien, which is the Akalabeth, a short book that is the story of the downfall of Numenor. And it's mostly prose, it's mostly narrative, it has very little in the way of dialogue, very little in the way of drama, very little in the way of conflict of any kind, and the same thing is true of the second thing that we're reading today. But the second thing that we're reading today is entirely more remarkable than the Akalabeth, or in my opinion, anything that Tolkien wrote. And it is, it's a very short thing called Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And it is, it is the story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, told in the register of the Silmarillion. So, this whole story that we know of, that a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins discovers a ring that can turn him invisible, that's being kept and coveted by a creature named Gollum. And then the whole story of the Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo Baggins gives the ring to his cousin Frodo Baggins. And Gollum is still alive, even though it's been decades later, and he himself has been alive for hundreds of years. And the suspicion starts to arise on the part of the wise, including Gandalf the Wizard, that this ring is in fact Sauron's one ring, which went missing when Sauron fought with men on the battlefield and was temporarily defeated. The ring went missing, and the wise thought for a while that it was lost forever. And it isn't. And that whole story of this one ring seeking slowly but inevitably to find the hand of its master, and the rise of Sauron and the threat of the final extinction of all hope of good on Middle-earth, that whole story that we know in so much detail from The Lord of the Rings, is in this little chapter of the Silmarillion told in a completely different way. Imagine if some other great epic that you know of ended that way. Imagine if some other great epic that we have of fantasy or of just in literature in general, even if it weren't in that epic, what if it were elsewhere? If we had that story told in a dramatic way, so not the author's notes, but a completely different register, a completely different tone of drama. That takes an amazing amount of disentanglement on the part of the author. I can only imagine what Tolkien must have cut away from Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age in order to get it to its present shape. Because we're told all sorts of things here that we aren't told explicitly in The Lord of the Rings. We have to stumble across these things in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But here, these are books of lore and legend. These are things whose stories have been passed on. And this is one of them, even though this is definitely not the book that Bilbo starts and Frodo finishes. This is definitely not that book. This knows things that Bilbo cannot possibly know. And doesn't know things that he does know. So we get to just a page in to this segment of the book. We get a summary of the whole of The Lord of the Rings, the whole of the setting, the whole of the idea, the ethos of The Lord of the Rings is summed up in one paragraph. And so it indeed has befallen. The 1 and the 7 and the 9, meaning the rings that were forged for the different races of mankind. The 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, and the 3 have passed away, and with them the Third Age is ended, and the tales of the Eldar in Middle-earth draw to their close. Those were the fading years, and in them the last flowering of the elves east of the sea came to its winter. In that time the Noldor walked still in the hitherlands, mightiest and fairest of the children of the world, and their tongues were still heard by mortal ears. Many things of beauty and wonder remained on earth in that time, and many things also of evil and dread. Orcs there were, and trolls, and dragons, and fell beasts. And strange creatures, old and wise in the woods, whose names are forgotten. Dwarves still labored in the hills, and wrought with patient craft works of metal and stone that none now can rival. but the dominion of men was preparing, and all things were changing, until at last the Dark Lord arose in Mirkwood again. And you see there that the rise of the Dark Lord in Mirkwood, Sauron, is in that pitch, in that register, it's almost an afterthought. We have already been told in that paragraph that wonder is leaving the world, good and bad, that all the things of enchantment are leaving the world. We're told about orcs and dragons and trolls and whatnot as though they were things of the distant past. They are clearly being talked about in passages like that one as part of a mythological past that no longer obtains. This is, in other words, despite what Tolkien might have some characters say, this is a lesser age that we're entering into. The third age is the last age of wonder and magic, after which the age of men will dawn, and there'll be nothing of the kind. But before it does, we get the story of the War of the Ring, told from almost a Valar point of view. It's told from a point of view pulled so far back that it almost bears no resemblance to the great story that we remember from Lord of the Rings. Like, for instance, we're told that the appearance of something new in Middle-earth. That almost never happens. If you think about, for instance, all that we've read in the Silmarillion, you realize how seldom Tolkien introduces anything new. The pattern of his storytelling is always that there are things in the world that are old. Some older than others, some very old, and that they are either unknown or they are rediscovered, but not something new. When in The Lord of the Rings we discover the Palantir, the Seeing Stones, it turns out it's very old. When a hobbit at the end of Lord of the Rings stabs the captain of the Nazgul, he stabs that captain not with an ordinary blade, but with a very old blade. It's clearly implied that an ordinary blade wouldn't have worked. When the captain of the Nazgul, for instance, is defeated, he's defeated because of the wording of an old prophecy. But in this little book, we get a mention of something new arriving at this time. Even as the first shadows fell in Mirkwood, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Astari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at the time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the lords of the west to contend the power of Sauron, if he should arise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. In the likeness of men they appeared, old but vigorous, and they changed little with the years, and aged but slowly, though great cares lay on them. And chief among these are two, Curanir, who's called by men Saruman, and Mithrandir, who is Gandalf. And these beings are mentioned for 2 paragraphs in this particular section of the Silmarillion as entering into the world. There's 2 who go east and do not enter into these tales. There's Radagast the Brown, Radagast the Bird Tamer, and then there's Gandalf and Saruman, who are such big parts of the Lord of the Rings. Here, talked about as if they were alien beings, because that's just what they are. This narration of them and everything else takes place from a point of view of indifferent omniscience. It's an omniscience that doesn't really care about the little details. It's telling you the big story, just as you realize it has about all of the stories in the past in the Silmarillion. So I'll get back to that. I want to mention, though, where the story goes on here. This is where it ends. This is the climax. This thing's only a few pages long. This is the climax of what it gets. Those who saw the things that were done in that time, deeds of valor and wonder, have elsewhere told the tale of the War of the Ring, and how it ended, both in victory unlooked for and in sorrow long foreseen. Here let it be said that in those days the heir of Isildur arose in the north, and he took the shards of the sword of Elendil, and at Imladris they were reforged, and he went then to war, a great captain among men. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and 39th heir in the right line of Isildur, and yet more like to Elendil than any before him. battle there was in Rohan, and Curunir the traitor was thrown down, and Isengard broken, and before the city of Gondor a great field was fought. And the Lord of the Morgul, captain of Sauron, there passed into darkness, and the heir of Isildur led the host of the west to the black gates of Mordor. In that last battle were Mithrandir and the sons of Elrond and the king of Rohan and the lords of Gondor and the heir of Isildur with the Dunedain of the north. There at last they looked upon death and defeat, and all their valor was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof that which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For, as many songs have since sung, it was the Perianath, the little people, the dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. For Frodo the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir took upon himself the burden, alone with his servant, and passed through peril and darkness, and came at last to Sauron's despite, even to Mount Doom. And there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade, and its evil consumed. Then Sauron failed, and he was utterly vanquished, and passed away like a shadow of malice, and the towers of Barad-dûr crumbled in ruin, and at the rumor of their fall many lands trembled. And that's it. That's the story of the climax of The Lord of the Rings. It's the first and only mention that this little bit of the Silmarillion gives of Frodo by name. And Frodo's servant is not named. Gollum is not named. The Ents are not mentioned. The Battle of Pelennor Field, we're told that the Lord of the Nazgul fell and passed into shadow. But we're not told how. That great scene where the Shield Maiden of Rohan takes off her helmet and says, "I am no man." The heroism of that moment is gone. The heroism of any moment is gone. We don't get any of the great memorable scenes of this story of The Lord of the Rings. We're told that the story is told elsewhere. Fine. Okay. But you could easily picture doing a one-page summary of The Lord of the Rings that included a lot of the stuff that we know. Legolas is not in here. Gimli is not in here. Boromir is not in here. The stories that on which the fate of these events actually depended are not given. Instead, only the broad outlines are, in this epic cadence that is the cadence of this whole book. And I think that's just amazing. I don't know of any equivalent, especially in high fantasy, but also in science fiction or anywhere else. I don't know of any equivalent. The closest, I've thought about this probably more than is healthy, and the closest that I can come to that kind of meta commentary, that kind of meta summary of events that we read passionately in deep detail, as though the details didn't matter, would be Frank Herbert in his book God, Emperor of Dune, which is the fourth book in his Dune cycle, and which takes place thousands of years after the last events of Children of Dune, by a character who actually remembers those events, who has lived that whole time, and can therefore look back on them with the telescoping backward gaze that omits details some and gives a broader view. But since that character was deeply involved in those events, both in Children of Dune and in God Emperor of Dune, that character is never indifferent. The God Emperor is never indifferent to those events. Not like this. This is the story of all the heroism that we have read, leached of heroism and turned into simply an annal, like you would find in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or something like that. And I think that's just fascinating. And when you read The Rings of Power in the Third Age in that way, and you realize, what about, there's no mention of Tom Bombadil. There's no mention of why Saruman falls, or how he falls, or anything like that. The Scouring of the Shire, anything. All of that is gone. There's no mention of Smaug, or Bilbo Baggins, none of that. When you realize how much is missing from this particular summary of the book that is to come, of the Lord of the Rings, of the end of the Third Age of man, of the Third Age of the Middle Earth, when you realize how much is missing that you could go back and read in, you suddenly realize that you could do that with a lot of stories in the Silmarillion. A lot of them engage in that same kind of epic telescoping. So that if you were to pick almost any one of them and go back to the pages in this book, you would see, oh, well, yeah, that is awful vague. Well, yeah, that does telescope things quite a bit. What about the story? It's an endless ground, in other words, for fan fiction, for pastiches. You could unpack this book endlessly with stories, even in the tales that are really well known, like Beren and Luthien or Turin and Turambar. Even in those tales that are told in great length, they are still told in the register of this final and remarkable book in the Silmarillion, so that you could go back and prize them apart and find the things they don't talk about. I think that's fascinating. I think it's an incredible way to end this book. And I don't know. I of course came to the Silmarillion after the Lord of the Rings, and I don't know what it would do to the reading experience of the Lord of the Rings to read that section of the Silmarillion before you read the Lord of the Rings. I don't know anyone. I've never met anyone in my life who read this book before they read the Lord of the Rings. They always come to it afterwards, so they know what's being left out. They know that shiver of excitement at reading about these things and knowing all the details that aren't included in this summary. I don't imagine that it's possible that any of you have read the Silmarillion before you read Lord of the Rings, but if you did, I would love to know. I've always wanted to know. I've never been able to find anybody who would tell me. I've always wanted to know what reading of the Rings of Power in the Third Age would do to your reading of the Lord of the Rings if you read it first. But one way or another, on that utterly remarkable note, I mean, imagine it. Imagine if a third-string character ended up War and Peace or Anna Karenina by describing the story in highly charged, dramatic language, but totally uninvolved. After you've gone through all the details, imagine what that would be like. But anyway, one way or another, that has always fascinated me. I think it's an amazing writing exercise. I think every writer ought to try it, especially every writer of epic fantasy ought to try it. It's a lot harder than it looks. But one way or another, with that brings to an end OcTolkien, our celebration of all things Tolkien for the month of October. I had a blast. I'm greatly looking forward to doing this next year. And of course, as has been true all month, I want to know what you thought. Especially there's a handful of you who are actually reading along with the Silmarillion with me. But even if you aren't doing that, if you've read the Silmarillion, I'd love to know what you think of it, because we're done with it now. And I will leave a link to my co-hosts and also to a series of videos that Lukash did on his channel about the Silmarillion, which are wonderful. And I've been linking to them every week because they're well worth your time. And that wraps up OcTolkien. It's been a whale of a time. Enormous fun. So I will close this for now, but we have plenty else to talk about. So I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.